thank you very much, Maike, not only for the invitation, but also to be able to readdress some questions. You actually forced me in some way to readdress some questions that have formed like the background or the entry to my own historical research when I somehow, I don't know why, transformed from a critical cultural psychologist to a historian. Now I'm somehow trying to come back in some way. The paradox that I started out with was a very basic observation that if you open up psychological textbooks like Springer or Pearson or whatever, as they are widely used nowadays, you will hardly find a page that is not filled with some kind of image material, stock photos or Philip Symbolic looking at Phineas Cage's skull, visual representations of statistical data, brain scans, and the one on the right, which I was most interested in actually, is flowcharts and altogether diagrams. So what is the paradox about this material, you might ask, because I said it's the paradox that I started out with. The paradox is because, according to Karl Popper and his theory of falsification, which serves as an epistemological background for the major part of experimental psychology, only sentences can be considered as the real hard core of science, a scientific theory, by constructing hypotheses, deducing predictions that are compared with empirical observations. Science is supposed to accumulate knowledge only by retaining those sentences which, although they might not be eternally true, have shown to withstand all attempts of falsification up till now. From this, I call this a logocentric position. This position actually Popper shared with the whole movement of logical positivism that he was so critical of, and a position that can be traced back to René Descartes' Discours de la méthode. Images might be used as aesthetically pleasing illustrations or decoration, but they can never attain the same as epistemological status as sentences, since they cannot be falsified in the same way. In contrast to the epistemological standpoint that is the foundation of major parts of mainstream psychology, in reality what we see is that images seem to fulfill a very important role within psychological research, not only in the presentation of results, like in, when you go to psychological conferences, mainstream psychology, you can see statistical data all over the slides. Yeah? This is just a presentation of results, but also what I found more interesting is the process of generating and selecting data, and most interesting for me, psychological theorizing, like how images are used to construct theories. While most experimental psychologists seem to ignore the fact that visuality and aesthetics play an important role for the outcome of their research, many historians of science and researchers in science and technology studies have analyzed the relevance of different visualization techniques in past and present. So this is a rather old topic in science and technology studies, but not in the history of psychology, and not in experimental psychology at all. Within this context, there is one type of images that I found extraordinarily interesting, and I wrote quite a few papers on different material. This is a symbolic medium which has received almost no attention until recently, but it was used since the 19th century. Diagrams. Probably the most famous one is the one in the middle, Freud's egg, as it was called. But I have material that goes back into the middle of the 19th century by Johann Friedrich Herbart, for example, who also used very simple diagrams to show the mechanics and statics of the human mind. So what's so interesting about diagrams is that they synthesize two different types of symbols: the written word and the iconic, that is lines and dots. This is like two different kinds of visual language or meaning constructing symbols that combine the serial logic of written language from left to right in German and English, and the language of spatiality that is used when you draw a line, where spatial distance has a very important meaning which it does not have in the written context. I give you just one example of what I did. If we look at Freud's famous Egg, which was first published in 1923, we can see that the concepts of ego and id are presented in an ascending hierarchical order from the bottom to the top, signifying not only a temporal order of old and new as the ego arises out of the id, but also an order of dominance and control from the bottom. The order of dominance and control from top to the bottom. Note also, like this is the ideal at least, what es war, soll ich sein, where it was, the ego shall be. Note also that, and this is what I found most interesting, is that the spatial extension plays a very important role here, which I try to demarcate here with the different colored areas, is a way of constructing meaning that you cannot do with the written language in this way. I mean, you can write a word in bold, so to say, or you can try to use one word in a much bigger font than any others, but that is not the way you would use your written language. You would rather draw it, and Freud actually writes down, this is just a metaphor, so to say. If I could, the id would be much bigger than what I have been drawing here, but for the because it's limited, is in the book, I have to print it out. I can only show you in this size. So spatiality and also drawing lines as borders are very important ways of constructing meaning in psychological theorizing. When you use diagrams, for example, note that there is like a doubled line between the ego and the repressed. It's not a channel actually from something coming outside the inside, but he wants to focus our attention on the fact that there's like something that we cannot go through. It's a border, it's a line. And I went through this idea of reconstructing like the visual logic or the visual symbolic grammar of psychological diagrams on a lot of different examples. So this is just one example of what I tried to do. And you can also compare it to other families of images. I was really happy when Lutz Eckensberger showed his flow charts, and then he emphasized that they make you think. Like if you have boxes and lines, then you start to think about how different processes relate to each other. And what I was interested in is how they make you think, because the way you use diagrams has some kind of inner visual logic that somehow seems to define concepts that make sense and other concepts that don't make sense anymore. Like what I did with the flow charts is trace them back to the 1940s when they were invented actually by physicists and mathematicians to give instructions to the engineers to build a machine that performs these kinds of mathematical operations. So this was a model to build something and not a model of something, so to say. And when it was taken up by Norbert Wiener in cybernetics during the 1940s and 50s, it somehow became something different. It became a visual logic that is now very common, and actually the context behind it, as well as what is implied and how it defines the borders and limits of our knowledge, are forgotten since then, because it's so long. But I don't want to talk too much about these kind of images. I want to talk about the last one that I found. It's not part of my dissertation, but I published one paper about it. I don't know if anybody has seen these pictures before. Maybe Herbert Fitzek has heard about it. Probably. I stumbled upon a family of psychological images which I found really interesting. The image of stratification or Schichtentheorie. It was hugely popular in the German academic landscape in the first half of the 20th century and almost completely forgotten after the 1960s. And what I want to do today is give you some historical context about the development and spreading of the theory of stratification or Schichtentheorie, as it was called. And also I would like to bring together my historical analysis with some thoughts about the use and functions of symbols as foundation of human interpretation and understanding, which in this case, like in a scientific context, and in this case, this means the scientific practice of the psychology of personality and expression psychology, or Ausdruckspsychologie, which was one methodology of the psychology of personality which was completely abandoned after the Second World War, but it was like the gold standard of psychological diagnostics during the 1930s, I would say, till the 1950s. So I will come back to these images in a moment and try to explain you a little bit what is actually to be seen here, or what the authors wanted you to see. I just have to note on a side note that there is a very long prehistory of Schichtentheorie. This is like the idea of visualizing the mind as a series of layers, as a hierarchical system. This idea can be traced back. I tried to do it in the publication. This idea can be traced back to the writings of Plato and Aristotle, and what I showed you here is like a medieval depiction of the souls arising from earth, like on the bottom up to God, to the highest being. And this idea of a hierarchical order of the universe was taken up by Leibniz. Again, nature knows no leaps. There are no holes, no gaps in the universe. So everything, every being that exists has its own place within the universe, and the degree of perfection defines its closeness to God. So what you see on the bottom actually of this big chain of beings, Arthur Lovejoy of course wrote the first history about this idea, is that man actually is in the middle and not at the bottom of or at the top of the universe. At the top, of course, is the being that is most perfect, that is God. At the very bottom is just pure matter. No system, no structure, just matter. Right? Between man and God, of course, are angels and different celestial beings, so to say. And this idea of the hierarchical order of the universe was taken up again in the 18th century by a lot of biologists, because they were searching for those animals that were still missing in this hierarchical idea of the universe, searching for the missing link, actually. So there is some kind of joke to this idea of the missing link, because it was a religious idea and not an anti-religious idea. And this idea of bottom and top, up and down and distance is a very spatial idea. It's a visual idea, it's a visual metaphor, if you want to say so. And at some point in the history of science, it was actually put from the bottom to the top. They turned it around. Matter or being is not something that is ascending from the top to the bottom. God created everything that is beneath him, but it's matter organizing itself, rising up from simple structures to more perfection. And that is actually what Schichtentheorie is. It is the idea that I'm using the concept system now. That systems, and you can use this theory on many different topics and levels, is the idea. You can explain it the simplest if you talk about biological evolution, because we are still used to that kind of Schichtentheorie. Corticalization is a process that starts out with simple nervous structures. This is from Ludwig Edinger, a physiologist at the beginning of the 20th century. And you start out with primitive animals that only have a very small cortical layer. And through the history of evolution, there is corticalization means a piling up of layers from very simple ones up to more complex ones. A piling up of layers, in German it works much better, you say Aufschichtung, means that old layers still stay where they were. They are not abandoned, They are not killed, or these are not stages in a Piagetian sense, like how Piaget would use the term. But the new ones are more complex. They rest upon the old ones. They steer and control them. I think it's easiest to understand this basic idea by looking at this neurological image, because the idea was in psychiatry that when you have some kind of diseases like Parkinson or dementia, where the new ones, the new cortical layers, at some point begin to dissolve, and the older ones take back control. Right? So mental disease is some kind of losing the control of new layers, and the old ones who are still like controlling breathing, basic physical, physiological functions are still working for some time, and they die as the last ones. Right? So that you just go back through evolution, or as Freud used the term, regression. Right? Regression is actually the taking back control of the old layers. What I was so fascinated about is that this theory was found in so many disciplines at the first half of the 20th century. This is, when I showed this to biologists the first time, they said, of course, this is how it is. Yeah? Schichten is just how the brain is structured. But this idea actually came up at the same time that it was used in many different disciplines outside of biology and medicine. Heinz Werner, for example, is a very well-known developmental psychologist who was convinced about the idea that development is also an Aufschichtung, a proliferation, a stratification of mental layers, and you start out with rather primitive ones, reflexes, instincts, and so on, and then through the first few years of your development, new, more complex layers evolve that rest upon the older ones. The older ones do not disappear. They need the older ones to keep functioning. If the older ones somehow get damaged, the new ones stop working immediately. But you have like more complexity, variety in your behavior, your attitudes towards your environment. You differentiate on a mental level. So I began my search. I read through many books and publications to look out where I will find some theories or images of stratification, and there was really a lot to be found, and at some point I said, I have to stop. This is just too much. This is turning into I don't know what, a lifelong project. During the first half of the 20th century, scholars across many different disciplines based their research on this visual order of stratification. Psychoanalysis is a child of Schichtentheorie, actually. Freud uses the concept of Schichten. He was a student of medicine, of course. And this was in the neurological discourse widespread all over. Jung, actually, is the most interesting image I think I found from Jung, also took it over. He used it in a slightly different sense, but the logic is still the same. It's a visual logic of up and down, of spatiality, of dominance and control, and of time that is just sedimented over the years. We found it in neurology, I showed you an image, philosophical anthropology, Scheler and Rodacker, for example, ontology, and metaphysics. This is really not well known, but there was a current in German thinking with Hartmann, for example, who had this idea that you can use Schichtentheorie to describe the system of the universe. The whole cosmos is basically a system of Schichten, of layers, starting out with physical material that somehow was at some point organized in a new layer, and that is living being. That is biological. And then you have the next step, living beings that are able to perceive and react towards their environment. And then the highest layer, of course, is the mental layer, those living beings who can think. Right? And if you cannot perceive, you cannot think. And if you cannot breathe and you don't have basic physiological functions, then you also cannot think. So you can see this is the very same visual logic that was introduced. We also have in sociology, Theodor Geiger, die Schichtung des deutschen Volkes, the idea that society is also stratified in different layers. Art and literature theory, Panofsky is also talking about the Schichtung of a work of art. And you have to go through these layers of images to actually understand their true meaning. So I hope to make it clear that this is not just a psychological thing, right? It's not just a psychological idea, but I want to focus for the rest of my talk on psychology as how this system of symbols was actually put into practice. So I'm not going too much into theory from now on. And also I want to reconsider how this visual logic can be used from a cultural psychological point of view, or at least try to explore different ways of how we can conceptualize them. So in 1932, when theories of stratification became really popular, immensely popular within the intellectual landscape of Germany, the psychologist Philipp Lash, who was one of the most famous psychologists in Germany for quite some time, published his habilitation thesis Face and Soul, Gesicht und Seele. These are all pictures taken out of that book. And Lash's book was the result of his work as a psychologist in the German Wehrmacht, in the military, for over 5 years. He worked in the Reichskriegsministerium. They had their own psychological laboratory here in Berlin. And what I have to say is that Wehrmachtspsychologie, German military psychology, became, during the Second World War, the biggest branch of applied psychology. They had a really high record number of 450 employed psychologists in the German Wehrmacht until 1942, when it was completely dissolved. That's another story. So this was hugely important for academic psychology to become a practical discipline, and also to get psychologists not just to be researchers, but also to get jobs. And Ausdruckspsychologie then, I will come back to this for a second, became like the applied branch of how you put stratification theory into use. It was the theoretical background of how you actually apply psychological diagnostics in the context of the Wehrmacht. I will give you a few examples so you can better grasp this. So what is the task? Why did psychologists work in the German Wehrmacht at all? The main task, of course, was the selection of soldiers and to give out recommendations of their proper use within the military. So to accomplish this task, German military psychologists relied on two different kinds of knowledges and practices. One part is, the term is not used at all anymore, but it was very normal to say psychotechnik. Psychotechnik, psychotechnik, were basically a set of methods and apparatuses that were imported from experimental psychology, who were used to test and quantify mental functions such as reaction time, sensory differentiation, speech comprehension, and so forth. These techniques were used to select suitable specialists such as pilots. You can see it here on the right, where they even developed huge apparatuses where you put people in, they don't see anything anymore, just small dots, and then you turn them around on their chair, they go all the time, and then they have to say how they are positioned in space with no orientation. So just one example. Or the Röhnrad, which is quite funny actually, where you put people, you can see you have this soldier in the background and he is turning this around, and here you have the candidate and he's turning, and while he is in this not very comfortable position, he has to do mathematical operations. 1 and 2 is 3 and so on. Right? And so this is psychotechnik. This is psychological diagnostics for the
Some call it torture.
Yeah, whatever you want to call it. So these are quantitative methods that are easily to apply and highly practical, but they had a problem with that because they were limited in the context of the selection of high-ranked officers, leading personnel, who were supposed to not just carry out orders but make tough decisions in complex combat situations, as well as lead and inspire their subordinates. A different kind of psychological knowledge was necessary to assess the whole character of the commanding officer and not just isolated psychological functions that you can easily measure. So what do? You need a new system of psychological diagnostics, and this is where I come back to Schichtentheorie, face and soul. This is the practical book that was published first by Lash, and Der Aufbau des Charakters, first published in 1938, was like the theoretical system that was in the background. Der Aufbau des Charakters, the structure of the character. After 1945 it was republished as the Aufbau der Persönlichkeit, because character was somehow had a little smell, Nazi smell within it, or the content stayed mostly the same. Here we have a kind of knowledge that was supposed to assess the whole character, die Ganzheit der Person, and not just measure isolated mental abilities. While the later work was the theory, and Schichtentheorie is like the standard textbook on expression psychology. It became a standard textbook actually on Ausdruckspsychologie. And the basic idea behind Ausdruckspsychologie is that facial, verbal and bodily movements or expression is not just a reaction to the momentary environment, but also a symbol of deeper layers of the person. So how the layers of the personality are structured, or how they relate towards each other. So Lash talks about symbols of expression or signs of expression, Ausdruckspsychologie. And Lash emphasizes, they can be used as an empirical foundation for the assessment of the person as a whole. The interpretational system of expression psychology was refined and extended by many psychologists, so it was not just Lash by himself, during the 1930s and 40s, and it was supposed to provide a new kind of knowledge about the individual Ganzheit, different kind of knowledge than experimental psychology. Not quantitative measurement, but careful observation. And this is my favorite word, mitschwingendes Urverstehen. Empathetic interpretation, it's very hard to translate this. Mitschwingendes Urverstehen, you actually try to synchronize on an emotional level with the person that you observe to create a knowledge about a person that is somehow based upon Menschenkenntnis, basic human understanding, but it is guided, it is structured by the system of expression. Psychology based on observing the moving surface of the body, especially the face. Mostly they're concentrated on the face, but there are also different kinds of observations. So what psychologists basically do, just to give you an idea, is they supervise 2-day programs of examinations at the psychological inspection offices in Germany and Ostmark or Austria to reveal the true structure of the character of military candidates. This is for high-ranked officers, not for the basic personnel, for the foot soldier. This is for the important officers. So what they did is they tried to give a system of analysis of facial expression, conduct, in German, much better, Gebaren, yeah. It's also hard to translate, speech and writing, a lot of graphology was also used, and observing the candidates in group situations, the so-called Führerprobe, leading test, Befehlsreihe, instruction series, where they had to balance on a wooden plank and see if they can keep their balance by also talking to each other. The leaderless group technique, where you put people around a chair with no guidance and see how they discuss a certain topic, which later taken up by the NASA actually, so the Americans really liked somehow of that. Yeah. And so on. And what they observed, there were medical tests of course to see if they are physically fit, but what psychologists were there for is to put one characteristic of the officer candidate under scrutiny, and that is, of course, political Weltanschauung, the right political positioning, but also the soldier, as the question if the soldier was equipped with a strong will. The strong will is the most important characteristic in German ideology. It's a very militant, military personality ideology, that the strong will was needed to be ready to give and follow orders and even sacrifice their lives in the face of danger. The strong will was not supposed to be grounded in dominance of higher layers, this would be intellectualism. This is what they hated. This is like Freudian psychoanalysis, the id conquering, the ego conquering and dominating the id. It is unity of instinct, of emotion and intellect. This is what they wanted. So you have a harmony of layers, and you want to see if this harmony of layers is present in the officer candidate that is in front of you. You can see that when you look at the diagnostical, I will read it to you. I don't know if you can read it. How psychologists describe the character of persons they were investigating. He's a very vivid, almost nervous guy, person, Mensch, human. Etwas blasiert, a little bit presumptuous. But behind that there's an active nature with a good will, will to serve, Leistungswillen, yeah, to serve, yes. He has very soldatische, it's very, he has a soldatic, no, you can say military, soldatische Neigung, and he has a useful character. So you see what this system has evolved in its practical context from an assessment of the whole person in its Ganzheit to his usefulness as a soldier. Mm-hmm. So there is a very clear focus that is looked upon in that was given by the practical context. So just to give you one example how this knowledge of the layers of personality was put into practice, I also want to show you a very short movie from the archive of the Psychological Institute in Vienna, because this is part of a big research project about the history of psychology and National Socialism that I've been working on for 3 years now. And what you can see now, it's a very short movie, is a film. They used a lot of film techniques to actually see how people react and to repeat that reaction and to carefully observe how the face changes. What you can see here now is a soldier. In the background you can see the ampere, and you will see a little bit better in a second. Soldiers had to actually pull expanders that were under electrical tension, and the stronger they pull, the higher the tension goes up. And they actually focused on the faces to see if they literally could keep their face. So if they would change the muscular tension, how they would look like. If there's some kind of twitching, if they can keep it straight, the face. If they would, you can see now the energy is coming, it's going up. I don't know if this gave you an idea, but this is, I was pretty happy when I found that. Yeah. So I hope I gave you a little bit of an idea how the symbolic knowledge that was based on observation of bodily movement and the face was actually put in practical use. Of course, there is a methodological critique of the low degree of objectivity and reliability and validity of a characterological examination. I don't think I have to tell you about that.
Excuse me, any critique about whether participants' knowledge about what they are being doing? Probably not.
If the soldiers knew what they, well, of course they knew that they were tested.
Yeah,
but for example, there was a lot of graphological testing where they had to write an essay on whatever, any kind of topic, and they didn't know what the psychologists were looking for. So one example, Peter Hofstetter in Vienna, he was pretty famous later on, didn't talk about his Nazi time very much. He developed Dunkelschrift, which is basically, now if I was Peter Hofstetter, I would say take out your papers and I want you to write something that somebody else is telling you, a diktat. Yeah? If somebody is saying something, you have to write it down, and then after 2 minutes I will switch off the light and you have to go on writing. And then I will shut it, I will turn it on again, and then when we're finished you can see that you have two kinds of texts. Actually, Dunkelschrift and Hellschrift. The writing that you've been done in the dark and the writing that you've done when it's... and then you can see how stable your handwriting is. Because the idea basically is that a strong character
has a stable handwriting, yeah, and you wouldn't know when you read that. Okay, this basically are some examples of how stratification theory was put into practice in Ausdruckspsychologie. Ausdruckspsychologie was completely abandoned after the 1950s. I don't know if completely, but it hasn't really survived. You won't find it in any curricula nowadays, I think. However, I'm not interested in any kind of methodological re-evaluation or rehabilitation of expression psychology. What I want to think about and discuss is how we can historically classify this framework of some symbolic interpretation, how we can understand it, what has been done here, and what we can learn about the problems that psychologists face when they are confronted with symbols and their traces. This is what they thought about when they saw this material. These are traces. Traces of the layers of the person that somehow are materialized now, but they can use them as a trace to actually go back to the deeper layers of the personality. What we can learn about the problems that psychologists face, especially when practical affordances pressure psychologists to introduce some kind of standardization of the interpretation of the symbol, because that's why I showed you this, how the soldier was described. They talked a lot about Ganzheit and the whole person, but they looked in practice only on a few aspects of this Ganzheit. So, in our everyday lives, we all infer inner states and personality traits from overt behavior, from facial expression, muscular movement, and the melody of speech. I'm looking at Jan and asking myself, is he tired or am I boring? I'm looking at Herbert and I'm thinking, is this real smile or is it just fake? Yeah? We do this every day, right? It's an everyday practice that we rely on to understand each other. So this, what expression psychologists did, is not something that was introduced by psychologists, but they made something else out of it. They introduced a system, they tried to standardize it. So expression psychology can be understood as an attempt to transfer our everyday Menschenkenntnis, basic human understanding, into a scientific framework. Of course, this was not the first one. We can talk about the physiognomy of the Johann Lavater, phrenology, of course, Gall, Spurzheim, and so on. They all had this very idea. You look for traces on the surface of the body, and then you try to find the connection on the inner, on the hidden side of the person. But I don't want to do an historical essay on the roots. I want to give you a suggestion of how we can understand this. This might be interesting for cultural psychologists. Just recently I found an essay by the Italian historian Carlo Ginzburg, Radici di un paradigma indiziato, ideas of a paradigm of Indizienwissenschaft, a science of
clue hunting.
Clue hunting, so thank you very much. In German, Spurenwissenschaft, Indizienwissenschaft or Spuren. The essay is called Spurensicherung. He had the idea that what he proposed, that there was a new system of knowledge that emerged in the human sciences at the end of the 19th century, and he names 3 authors. So it's a little bit hard to name just 3 authors and say this is a new paradigm that is all over the human sciences, but I think the suggestion he does is very interesting for us cultural psychologists. He cites the art historian Giovanni Morelli, Sigmund Freud, and Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes. This is not Conan Doyle, but I think Sherlock Holmes is more easy to see. As the 3 famous representatives of a methodology based on the, quote, analysis of particular cases constructed only through traces, symptoms, and hints. Probably the least known for most of people is Giovanni Morelli. He became famous for his analysis of circumstantial details of works of art, such as the shape of the hand or an ear, to identify the true creator of a piece of art. So you should not look on the most typical or representative part of a famous work of art to identify the creator, but you look on small parts that are somehow on the edge or somewhere where you wouldn't really look very deeply into it or to identify them, because that's where they don't put so much attention to usually, or that's when the personal style becomes visible, because that's what he suggests. Some creators have a very distinct style of how they draw hands or ears, and if it's not a very important part of the work of art, they reveal themselves unknowingly, without wanting to do that. Sherlock Holmes, of course, was obviously a master of collecting clues and signs, which would help him to keep track of the criminal. And Freud cited both Morelli and Holmes, or Doyle, as inspirations and models for the uncovering of hidden unconscious elements and symbols in his patients, and when he talks to his patients, on several occasions. So he cites them, and we talked about Freud's connection to art theory and art history, and Ginsberg puts a very strong emphasis on that connection. Morelli, Doyle and Freud were all students of 19th century medicine. And Ginsberg classifies these three authors as representatives of an epistemological framework of medical semiotic, that's what he calls this, or symptomatology, a model, quote, which permits diagnosis, though the disease cannot be directly observed, on the basis of superficial symptoms or signs, often irrelevant to the eyes of the layman or even of Dr. Watson. Semiotics does not deduct hypotheses from general principles like the Galilean or Cartesian model. So he builds up some kind of epistemological dualism where he proposes two different sets of how to create and produce knowledge. The Galilean Cartesian model is based on abstraction of the concrete attributes of what you observe. It is formalized, it is quantitative, and is experimental. So what you have here on the top left is the famous experiments of Galilei, who tries to find the laws of gravity by using these small tubes where you have the ball just running down, and he's not really interested in the material object that he uses. He's abstracting from their concrete attributes. He wants to generate a universal knowledge that is just beyond the situation and the objects that he uses. And then we have an older semiotic medical model that is based on, quote, particular cases constructed only for traces, symptoms and hints. Well, then, in the context of medicine, the disease as a distinct entity is considered unattainable. You cannot really see the disease. The expression psychologists will say you cannot see the whole person at once, but you can see the traces, the symptoms, the symbols of them on the surface. The registration and careful investigation of each symptom enables the expert to recover the unique history of a case. So, Ginsberg's use of the concept of paradigm might be a little bit exaggerated, I have to say, but this is not really my point. What I'm interested in is that on the one side you have a rationalist Galilean concept of the natural sciences in Ginsberg's view, which sacrifice knowledge of the individual in favor of general formalized law, and it creates an emotional distance between the observer and the observed. So you have very far away from mitschwingendes Urverstehen. Yeah, this is like the complete opposite, so to say. And you have a semiotic approach which focuses on scattered and hidden elements, often overlooked, which define the uniqueness of the observed. He also calls these conjectural disciplines or Indizienwissenschaft. Some of them are really successful. Medicine, paleontology, evolution theory, forensics, biology, they all show great success. Some are other semiotic disciplines, such as astrology or alchemy, not so much. But they still exist till the present day, and one argument of my talk is that expression psychology can be put into this line of knowledge, and it was interestingly abandoned after the 1950s, although it addresses an everyday practice that we still engage in all the time. So I will be finished in 2 minutes. This is where we come back to expression psychology and stratification theory. Obviously, expression psychologists did not argue that there is nothing behind the observed. So this would be a positivist epistemological standpoint or a behaviorist in the context of psychology. There is nothing behind the reaction. There is just a sum of reactions, so to say. They were convinced that the movement of facial muscles, eyes and mouth, as well as the style of the conduct, represent traces that lead us far down to the hidden layers of the personality. Now I quote Ginsberg, "The existence of a deep connection which explains superficial phenomena can be confirmed when it is acknowledged that direct knowledge of such a connection is impossible. So reality is opaque, the personality is not visible. But there are certain points, clues and symptoms which allow us to decipher it." But there is a fundamental dilemma which Ginsberg draws our attention to. A dilemma which seems to haunt psychology up to the present day. As I have mentioned, expression psychology was abandoned in Germany. The conjectural perspective was replaced by a Galilean one in mainstream psychology. But personality psychologists had to pay a price for that. As Ginsberg noted, either the human sciences achieve significant results from a scientifically weak position, or they put themselves in a strong scientific position which produce mostly irrelevant results. And that is a critique that we can hear very often, I guess, towards mainstream psychology. I am neither saying that all results of characterology and expression psychology were totally irrelevant, nor that all knowledge of Galilean personality psychology is completely useless, but I still do have the impression that mainstream personality psychology has moved away from Menschenkenntnis. And that was Menschenkenntnis, basic human understanding. I know it's a strong word in German, I don't know if you... Yeah. Everyday human understanding. Psychology has moved away from that by abandoning its knowledge about the deciphering of hidden traces and symbols. Thank you very much.